The official story says the United States overthrew the government of Guatemala in 1954 because a communist threat had taken root in the hemisphere and had to be removed before it spread. The president in question, Jacobo Árbenz, had accepted support from a small local communist party, had legalized labor unions, and had signed a land reform law that redistributed idle farmland to landless peasants. In Washington, this was framed as the opening move of a Soviet foothold in the Americas, a domino that could not be allowed to fall. That is the account still repeated in most textbooks. What the record shows, when the financial ledger is placed beside the political explanation, is a different sequence entirely. Years before any Guatemalan official used the word communism in a policy document, a single American corporation had already begun building the case in Washington for removing the man who now sat in the National Palace. The corporation owned the country's only useful railroad, its principal port, a controlling stake in its electric utility, and more land than the Guatemalan state itself. Its name was the United Fruit Company, and the story of how it lost a portion of that land is the story of how a government fell. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The company's roots in Central America went back to 1899, when a merger between the Boston Fruit Company and the railroad and banana concerns of a contractor named Minor Cooper Keith created United Fruit as a single corporate entity. Keith had spent the previous 2 decades building railroads through Costa Rica in exchange for land grants, discovering along the way that bananas, planted along the rail lines to generate freight revenue while the track was under construction, were more profitable than the railroad itself. Andrew Preston, a Boston produce dealer, supplied the merger's northern half, the shipping and distribution network that could move the fruit from tropical port to American breakfast table before it spoiled. The combined company inherited a business model that depended on owning, rather than merely operating, every link in the chain: the land the bananas grew on, the railroad that carried them to the coast, the port that loaded them onto refrigerated steamships, and increasingly, the political relationships that kept all of it running without interference. Zemuri's own history mattered here. Before he sold his Cuyamel Fruit Company to United Fruit and took a board seat, and later the presidency, of the larger firm, he had already demonstrated what a banana company was willing to do when a Central American government threatened its concessions. In 1911, angry that the Honduran government had raised duties on his shipments and was negotiating a loan with American bankers on terms that would have tightened oversight of foreign land deals, Zemuri financed a small mercenary expedition led by a soldier of fortune named Lee Christmas, who landed on the Honduran coast, gathered a few hundred armed men, and helped install a new president sympathetic to Cuyamel's interests within months. The episode became one of the sources for the term Banana Republic itself, coined by the writer O. Henry, to describe exactly this kind of arrangement: a nominally sovereign state whose government answered, in practice, to a fruit company's balance sheet. By the time Zemuri brought that same instinct for direct intervention into United Fruit's leadership 2 decades later, the company he now ran had already absorbed the lesson that a government could be replaced when it became inconvenient, and had the financial means to make replacement look, from a distance, like something else entirely. Under his leadership, and that of the executives who followed him, the corporation had become the largest single landowner in Guatemala and the largest private employer in the country. It also controlled, through subsidiary and shareholding arrangements, the international railways of Central America, which ran nearly every mile of track in the country, and Puerto Barrios, the Caribbean port through which most of Guatemala's exports and imports passed. Guatemalans had a name for the arrangement. They called the company El Pulpo, the Octopus, because there was no part of the national economy its arms did not reach. Company towns along the Atlantic coast ran their own schools, their own commissaries, their own hospitals, and in practice their own security forces, paying wages in company scrip, redeemable at company stores, and enforcing a racial hierarchy, inherited from the company's earlier operations in the British Caribbean, that placed West Indian and black Guatemalan workers below white American managers and Ladino workers above both. The arrangement produced enormous profit and equally enormous resentment, and it was that resentment, organized through the labor code Arévalo's government had passed in the late 1940s, that gave United Fruit's Guatemalan workforce its first legal tools to unionize, tools the company had never had to contend with in more than 4 decades of operating inside the country. That reach was not incidental. It was negotiated, contract by contract, with a series of Guatemalan governments willing to trade long-term sovereignty for short-term capital. The most consequential of these governments belonged to Jorge Ubico, a dictator who ruled from 1931 to 1944, and who extended United Fruit's concessions on terms remarkable, even by the standards of the era. Ubico granted the company exemption from import duties, exemption from internal taxes on its exports, and title to hundreds of thousands of acres of land, much of it left uncultivated as a hedge against banana blight and future expansion. Ubico's most consequential contract with the company, signed in 1936, ran for 99 years and folded most of United Fruit's Guatemalan operations into a subsidiary called the Compañía Agrícola de Guatemala. The agreement guaranteed the subsidiary exemption from import duties on machinery, fuel, and construction material, exemption from most internal taxation, and a further grant of land along the Pacific coast to be developed as a hedge against disease outbreaks in the company's existing Atlantic side plantations. In exchange, Guatemala received wages for its workers, freight fees from the railroad, and the promise, never legally guaranteed but politically understood, of a government willing to keep labor organizing off the company's properties. Ubico enforced that promise personally, banning strikes outright and treating any organizing effort on a United Fruit plantation as a matter for his own secret police, rather than a labor dispute for the courts to settle. Critically, for reasons that would matter 2 decades later, United Fruit itself set the declared value of that land for tax purposes, and it set that value low. A corporation paying property tax has every incentive to understate what its land is worth. United Fruit understated it for years, filing declared values a fraction of what the land would fetch on an open market, and the Guatemalan tax authorities, dependent on the company's goodwill and lacking any independent survey to contradict it, generally accepted the figures it submitted. This was not a hidden arrangement. It was published in the country's own tax rolls. It would later become the single most consequential number in the entire affair. Ubico fell in October of 1944, toppled by a coalition of students, junior officers, and professionals who wanted an end to 4 decades of dictatorship and the beginning of something resembling representative government. The revolution installed Juan José Arevalo as president in 1945, a philosophy professor who introduced Guatemala's first labor code, its first social security system, and its first minimum wage law, all of which applied, whether the company liked it or not, to United Fruit's tens of thousands of Guatemalan workers. Arevalo survived more than 20 coup attempts during his term, a number that itself tells you how contested the new order was. He was succeeded in 1951 by Jacobo Árbenz, a former army colonel who had helped lead the 1944 uprising and who campaigned on a promise to convert Guatemala from what he called a backward, semi-colonial economy into a modern capitalist one, built not on foreign-owned plantations but on a domestic class of small and medium landowners producing for the national market. Árbenz was, by the documentary record available today, not a communist himself, though he governed in coalition with a small local communist party, the Guatemalan Labor Party, which held only 4 seats out of 56 in the National Congress, but occupied several influential posts inside the agrarian reform bureaucracy, including a role in drafting the technical formulas Decree 900 would use to value expropriated land. That coalition, more than any single policy, is what allowed Washington to file Árbenz under a label that made everything that followed easier to justify. The policy that mattered financially arrived in June of 1952. Decree 900, Guatemala's agrarian reform law, authorized the government to expropriate the uncultivated portions of large estates and redistribute that land to landless and land-poor peasants, who would receive it in exchange for annual payments back to the state. It was not a confiscation of everything a landowner held. Cultivated land was untouched. Estates under a certain size were untouched entirely. The law targeted specifically the vast idle acreage that companies like United Fruit held as reserve land, uncultivated, unused, and functioning mainly as an insurance policy against the day the company's existing plantations wore out. Guatemala was not the only country where this pattern had already played out. United Fruit held similarly generous concessions in Honduras, Costa Rica, and Colombia, and in each of those countries the company's declared property values for tax purposes ran consistently below the figures its own internal shareholder reports used to describe the same land's worth to investors. Guatemala differed only in being the first of the company's Central American holdings to attempt a formal, legally structured expropriation rather than a negotiated buyout, which is exactly why the compensation dispute that followed became the test case the company was determined to win decisively rather than settle. Nationally, over the 2 years the law remained in force, the government redistributed roughly 1.5 million acres to more than 100,000 families, the largest transfer of land in Guatemalan history and, measured by acreage, one of the largest anywhere in Latin America up to that point. United Fruit's uncultivated holdings on Guatemala's Pacific coast accounted for roughly 400,000 of those acres, and the government moved to expropriate them first, offering compensation in 25-year government bonds paying 3% annual interest. The amount of that compensation was calculated the only way Guatemalan law allowed it to be calculated, based on the value the landowner itself had declared for tax purposes. For United Fruit, after 2 decades of deliberately understated tax filings, that number came out to slightly over $1 million. The reform's mechanics ran through a network of local agrarian committees, elected bodies at the municipal level, authorized to identify idle land, verify ownership, and forward expropriation petitions to a national agrarian department for final approval. It was a slower and more bureaucratic process than the phrase land reform tends to suggest, closer to a formalized administrative pipeline than a wave of seizures, and it was this same pipeline, staffed in part by the Guatemalan Labor Party members who had helped design it, that processed the United Fruit case in December of 1952, months before the compensation dispute reached Washington at all. United Fruit's response was to reject the number outright and to ask the United States government to intervene on its behalf, demanding compensation closer to $16 million, the figure the company now claimed the land was actually worth. The gap between what the company had told the Guatemalan Tax Authority for 20 years and what it told the American State Department in 1953 was not a rounding error. It was roughly 15 times the declared value, and it exposed, in a single administrative dispute, the mechanism that had made the entire concession system work in the company's favor for decades. Understate the value while the tax bill is due. Restate it upward the moment expropriation becomes the alternative. The company had built its own trap and then, when Guatemala closed it, demanded the trap be reopened on entirely different terms. To put the disputed sum in perspective, $16 million was a figure larger than a meaningful share of the entire annual budget of the Guatemalan government at the time, a country whose national income depended heavily on the same export trade the company itself controlled. Guatemala was, in effect, being asked to compensate its largest landowner for land it had valued for tax purposes at a fraction of that sum, using a currency reserve the landowner's own export duties helped supply in the first place. Not every official inside the American government treated the dispute as a foreign policy emergency. Career officers on the State Department's own Guatemala desk, along with some of the diplomats who had served in Guatemala City directly, argued in internal memoranda that Decree 900 looked less like a communist confiscation and more like a conventional, if aggressive, capitalist land reform of the kind the United States had itself encouraged in occupied Japan under General Douglas MacArthur only a few years earlier. That view did not prevail, and the officials who held it did not control the policy machinery that decided Guatemala's fate. What made this dispute different from an ordinary commercial disagreement was the density of personal connection between the company and the American officials who did control that machinery. The law firm that had negotiated United Fruit's original concession contracts with the Guatemalan government in the 1930s was Sullivan and Cromwell, a New York firm whose senior partner for decades was a lawyer named John Foster Dulles. By 1953, Dulles was serving as United States Secretary of State, the official responsible for weighing Guatemala's land reform against American foreign policy. His younger brother, Allen Dulles, had also worked at Sullivan and Cromwell and had sat on United Fruit's board of directors before taking over, that same year, as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, the official directly overseeing Latin American policy, was a career diplomat named John Moores Cabot, whose brother, Thomas Dudley Cabot, had recently served as president of United Fruit itself. The company's public relations director, a former journalist named Edward Whitman, was married to Ann Whitman, who worked as President Eisenhower's personal secretary throughout his time in the White House, typing and filing many of the same national security memoranda her husband's employer had a direct financial stake in. Thomas Dudley Cabot, the former United Fruit president whose brother now oversaw Latin American policy at state, had left the company only a few years earlier to run the federal import-export program, placing a second Cabot inside the same government, weighing his former employer's compensation claim. None of these relationships were secret. They were listed in public directories, corporate filings, and government biographies. What they produced, when combined, was a policy apparatus in which the officials evaluating a Guatemalan tax dispute had, in nearly every relevant office, a prior professional or family tie to the company on the losing end of it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. United Fruit did not rely on personal connections alone. The company had retained the counsel of Edward Bernays, a pioneer of modern public relations who had spent years cultivating friendly coverage of the company among American journalists, flying reporters to Guatemala on company expense for guided tours of company towns and hospitals, and feeding Washington correspondents a narrative that framed Decree 900 not as a land reform, but as the leading edge of a communist takeover of the hemisphere. Bernays commissioned and distributed a booklet titled Report on Guatemala to members of Congress and to newsroom editors across the country, laying out, in the company's own framing, the danger the agrarian reform posed to hemispheric security. Bernays understood something the company's lawyers understood less well, that a compensation dispute over declared tax values would never generate the political will for a foreign policy response, but a communist threat to the Panama Canal's southern flank would. By the time the National Security Council formally discussed Guatemala in 1953, the language in use inside the American government echoed the language United Fruit's public relations operation had been placing in American newspapers for 2 years, and Secretary Dulles carried that language into a hemispheric forum built to make it official policy rather than a single nation's grievance. At the 10th Inter-American Conference in Caracas in March of 1954, Dulles pressed the Organization of American States to adopt a resolution declaring that the domination of any American state by the international communist movement would be considered a threat to the sovereignty and political independence of every state in the hemisphere, providing grounds for collective action under the region's existing security treaty. The resolution passed over Guatemala's own objection, with only its delegation voting against it and 2 others abstaining, giving Washington a multilateral cover for a policy it had already begun to execute unilaterally through the Central Intelligence Agency. The Eisenhower administration authorized a covert operation, given the cryptonym PBSUCCESS, with an initial budget in the range of $2,700,000, later expanded, to remove Árbenz from power without a conventional invasion. The Central Intelligence Agency recruited a Guatemalan exile officer named Carlos Castillo Armas to lead a small force across the Honduran border, backed not by its own numbers, which never exceeded a few hundred men, but by a psychological operation built around a fabricated radio station, the Voice of Liberation, that broadcast reports of a much larger advancing army than actually existed, and by a handful of unmarked aircraft flown by American contract pilots that bombed targets in and around Guatemala City. Parallel to the military deception ran a diplomatic one. The American ambassador in Guatemala City, John Purifoy, met directly with the country's senior military commanders in the final days of June, pressing them to withdraw their support from Árbenz rather than risk what he characterized as open conflict with the United States, a pressure campaign that did as much to end the government as Castillo Armas's small column ever could have on its own. The Guatemalan army, uncertain of the invading force's true size, unnerved by Purifoy's warnings, and unwilling to arm the peasant militias that had formed around the agrarian reform program, refused to fight. On the 27th of June 1954, Jacobo Árbenz resigned and left the country. The staging ground for the entire operation sat across 2 friendly borders, in Honduras and in Nicaragua, where the American-backed governments of those countries, the latter run by the Somoza family, allowed the Central Intelligence Agency to base its aircraft and train Castillo Armas's small force without formal acknowledgement on either side. Castillo Armas took power within days, and one of his new government's first acts was the reversal of Decree 900. The expropriated land, all of it, went back to United Fruit. The peasants who had received titles under the reform lost them. Guatemala's brief experiment in agrarian redistribution and the 25-year bonds that had been meant to pay for it ended before a single bond had matured. For more than 4 decades, the American government's official position on the Guatemala operation remained deliberately thin, a matter of Cold War necessity rather than corporate advocacy, consistent with the public explanation Eisenhower himself had given at the time. That position began to erode in 1997, when the Central Intelligence Agency, under a court order tied to a broader declassification effort, released an internal historical study of the Guatemala operation, written years earlier by an agency historian named Nicholas Calather. The study had been commissioned for internal use only, and had never been intended for public release. It confirmed the operation's scale and mechanics in detail the agency had spent decades declining to acknowledge, including the existence of an assassination component, internally referred to inside the planning documents as a disposal list, of roughly 58 Guatemalan officials, army officers, and labor organizers the agency had identified for elimination if Castillo Armas's forces took power and resistance continued. The list was drawn up, names attached, and passed through multiple drafts inside the agency's own paramilitary planning division, but according to the study it was never fully executed, in large part because Árbenz' resignation made the wider invasion, and the occupation that would have required it, unnecessary. Its existence was not part of any public congressional testimony, any State Department white paper, or any account the American government had offered in the 4 decades since the coup. It surfaced only because an internal historian, writing for an audience of one, had recorded what the operational planning had actually included, and a later declassification review released his work along with everything else scheduled for that year, over the objections of agency officials who argued the study remained too sensitive to publish even 4 decades on. A second gap in the record closed, or rather reopened, around the same period. The State Department's own historical office publishes a series called Foreign Relations of the United States, intended as the authoritative documentary record of American diplomacy. The volume covering Guatemala for the years 1952 through 1954, published in 1983, had been edited under Central Intelligence Agency review in a way that omitted the agency's role in the coup almost entirely, presenting the change of government as a matter of internal Guatemalan politics rather than an American covert operation. Professional historians objected publicly, arguing that the volume, meant to be the government's own honest record of its actions, had instead been shaped to protect the reputation of the agency that had planned the operation it was supposed to document. Much of what is now understood about the financial motive behind the operation did not come from either of these declassifications alone. It came from historians such as Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer, whose book on the coup drew on interviews with surviving participants on both the American and Guatemalan sides, and from Piero Glegeses, whose later archival work reconstructed the internal Guatemalan side of the story that the American record alone could never have shown. Each account, published years apart and built from a different set of sources, converged on the same underlying sequence, a tax dispute, escalated by personal connection and public relations into a national security question, resolved by force. In 2003, the State Department issued a formal retraction, an unusual step for a series that prided itself on being the government's authoritative self-record, and released a revised volume restoring the agency's planning role, its budget history, and its internal debates to the printed page. The gap between the two versions, published 20 years apart under the same series title, is itself a measure of how long an official record can misstate its own history before correction, and how much of that history depends on who is permitted to write the first draft, and who is permitted, decades later, to insist on a second one. The consequence of the 1954 coup did not end with the land returning to united fruit. Castillo Armas's government, and the string of military and quasi-military governments that followed it over the next several decades, dismantled not only the agrarian reform, but the labor protections and political openness the 1944 revolution had built. Guatemala entered a civil war in 1960 that would run for 36 years, one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in modern Latin American history. A United Nations-backed Truth Commission, the Historical Clarification Commission, concluded in 1999 that state security forces were responsible for the overwhelming majority of the roughly 200,000 deaths and disappearances documented during the war, and that certain military campaigns against the country's Maya population during the early 1980s, which the Commission found had destroyed more than 600 Maya villages through what its report called scorched earth operations, met the legal definition of genocide. Efraín Ríos Montt, the general who governed during the most intense period of that campaign, was convicted of genocide by a Guatemalan court in 2013, a verdict overturned days later on procedural grounds and never fully retried before his death, leaving the country's highest-profile case against its own wartime command structure permanently unresolved. None of the American officials who had helped remove Árbenz in 1954 lived to see that trial. Dulles left the State Department in 1959, ill with the cancer that would kill him the following year, still regarded in Washington as the architect of a firm Cold War posture, rather than as a former corporate lawyer settling his old firm's oldest client's account. His brother Alan was dismissed from the Central Intelligence Agency in 1961 after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and died in 1969. Neither man's public record credits the Guatemala operation with the outcome its own internal planning documents describe. That same year, on a visit to Guatemala City, President Bill Clinton stated publicly, in remarks his own staff had cleared in advance, that American support for Guatemalan security forces during the conflict had been wrong, and that the United States would not repeat that mistake. It was as close to an official acknowledgement as the events of 1954 and their aftermath would ever receive from the government that had set them in motion, delivered 45 years after the fact, to a country still counting its dead. The operation itself outlived the country it had been built to redirect. Inside the Central Intelligence Agency, PBSUCCESS was studied and reused as a working template. The same combination of a small exile force, a fabricated radio broadcast, and psychological pressure on a target government's own military command structure. For the far larger and far less successful invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and elements of it echoed again in the American-linked coups and destabilization campaigns that followed in Chile in 1973 and elsewhere in Latin America over the next 2 decades. A covert operation built to resolve one corporation's tax dispute had become, without any public vote or open debate about its merits, the standard playbook for a generation of American intervention in the hemisphere. United Fruit itself did not long outlive the arrangement it had spent half a century building. Banana blight, labor unrest, and the loss of its most reliable political guarantees in Central America eroded its position through the 1960s, and in 1970, the company merged with a meatpacking conglomerate to form United Brands, under the leadership of a financier named Eli Black. In 1975, federal investigators uncovered evidence that United Brands had paid a bribe of $1.25 million to a senior Honduran government official in exchange for a reduction in that country's banana export tax, a scandal the press quickly labeled Bananagate. Days before the story broke publicly, Eli Black stepped out of a window on the 44th floor of the Pan Am building in New York and fell to his death. The company survived him, restructured, sold off its meatpacking and shipping divisions one at a time, and eventually became Chiquita Brands International in 1990, a name chosen in part to distance the corporation from the history attached to the old one and to attach itself instead to the blue and yellow banana sticker that had become, by then, a more familiar symbol than the company's actual legal name. The distancing was not complete. In 2007, Chiquita pleaded guilty in an American federal court to charges of making payments worth more than $1.7 million over roughly 7 years to a paramilitary organization in Colombia that the United States government had designated a terrorist group. Payments, the company said, were made under threat of violence against its local banana operations in the country's northern provinces. The corporate structure had changed its name twice since 1954, from United Fruit to United Brands to Chiquita, shedding the old name each time the old name became a liability, filing for bankruptcy protection along the way in 2001, and again decades later as banana prices and legal settlements ate into margins the company had once protected through concessions rather than competition. The pattern underneath the name, a fruit company's ledger intersecting with a foreign government's use of force, had not changed at all. What the ledger shows, when the compensation dispute of 1952 is placed beside the covert operation of 1954, is not a story about the containment of Soviet influence in Central America, however sincerely some of the officials involved may have believed that framing at the time. It is a story about a corporation that spent 20 years declaring its land nearly worthless to avoid paying tax on it, and then, when a government used that same declared value to calculate compensation for expropriation, mobilized a Secretary of State who had once negotiated its contracts, a Central Intelligence Agency director who had once sat on its board, an Assistant Secretary of State whose brother had run the company, a presidential secretary married to its publicist, and a public relations campaign that recast a tax dispute as a hemispheric emergency until the government of a sovereign nation fell, a war began that would run for 36 years, and the land went back to the company that had undervalued it in the first place. The declassified assassination list, the twice-written State Department volume, and a president's apology delivered 45 years after the fact are the only parts of that ledger the public record was ever permitted to see on its own terms, and each of them arrived only because someone with access to the files eventually let them out, long after the officials who had the most reason to keep them closed were no longer in a position to stop it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.